Um, the reason I wanted to focus on the design argument in this, section where we're looking at some problems in the philosophy of religion as a sub-branch of metaphysics is because, as some of you know, it's gotten a lot of publicity in the past few years. The question whether intelligent design should be taught in the public schools as an alternative to, or at least alongside evolutionary theory, has been controversial. As I said, there's a Frontline documentary on this in your extra credit folder if you want to look at some more. Aquinas' first three ways are versions of the cosmological argument, which, just for purposes of time, we're not going to consider. The fourth one is different entirely. We're not going to worry about that. But his fifth way is a version of the design argument. Now, on the blackboard, the whiteboard, you'll see the word teleological argument. That's another name for the design argument. And it gets its name from the Greek word telos, which means an end or goal or purpose. And we saw in Aristotle that he has a view of the world as a place where things and even human beings have built-in purposes, and also constructed things by human beings, like a knife, have built-in purposes, at least purposes built into them. And so the design argument gets its start from observing things in the world and seeing that there are things around that serve an end or purpose. And it asks the question, well, how did they come about to be such that they serve an end or goal or purpose? Now, Aquinas is writing in the Middle Ages, the early Middle Ages, and the early Christian church liked the works of Plato, at least some of them did, because they're kind of otherworldly. We saw Plato and Socrates both argued in the continued existence of the soul, which we don't think Aristotle believed in. We saw also that Plato was kind of otherworldly in thinking that there's another world, an intellectual world. Aristotle was, the church was not as kind to the works of Aristotle. They didn't like the fact that Aristotle focused so much on this world. And so they fell out of favor when Christianity took over. And oddly enough, they were preserved for about 1,000 years in Arab countries, in Islamic countries. And while we can say a lot of negative things about the Crusades, and it's fashionable to do that, one of the things that happened was that works, like the works of Aristotle that had been lost to the Western world and Western civilization for 1,000 years, were being rediscovered and brought back. And so you'd have people who were theologians defending the position of the church, who had to deal with the fact that so much of this impressive stuff was being rediscovered. So how do they fit in some of the impressive philosophy of Aristotle with what the church also believed was true? And Aquinas was perhaps the most famous single theologian who, in the Roman Catholic tradition, tried to reconcile some of the arguments from the works of Aristotle with what the church was teaching. And the fifth way of Aquinas' 5 ways to prove God's existence is a very old, simple statement of the design argument. And like Aristotle, Aquinas views nature as a place where things serve various purposes or functions, and then asks how that came to be about. And of course, the Judeo-Christian perspective on this is that things serve purposes in nature because that's the way they were designed by God. So, in Aquinas' 5th way, and this is on the same PowerPoint with the ontological argument, he begins with this observation. He says, things in nature that don't have understanding or intelligence themselves nonetheless seem to function such that they serve a purpose, nonetheless act toward an end or goal, a telos in the Greek, hence teleological argument. But Aquinas says, wait a second, if they don't have intelligence themselves, if they lack understanding or intelligence, how comes this about? How does it come about that they serve a function or goal? Since, lacking intelligence, they cannot direct themselves toward this goal. Now, the illustration that Aquinas himself uses is maybe not the best one, but take an arrow and the goal, the end of shooting the arrow, if you're target shooting, is right to hit the bullseye of a target. But he says, lacking intelligence, an arrow cannot direct itself toward its target by itself. It has to be directed toward it by an intelligent archer. Now, we might say, well, yeah, but that's not true today. We've got smart bombs. We've got guided missiles that can do that. But how is it that they can do that? Well, because they are programmed to do that by an external intelligence. That's how, the missile can reach its target. So it doesn't moot the point that Aquinas is trying to make. So he says there are other things that seem to serve functions, that seem to be directed toward ends. Just like, remember, Aristotle's example was an acorn. Seems to be directed toward the end of producing an oak tree. How does this come about? So he says things in nature that fulfill a goal or purpose can't direct themselves toward this purpose since they don't have understanding or intelligence. So Aquinas' answer then is they need to be directed for that goal or purpose by an external intelligence, by an intelligent designer. Now, for Aquinas, there's only one answer here, and that is that that intelligent designer is none other than the God of the Bible and church tradition. It's interesting that there was a translation of the Old Testament in Hebrew, from Hebrew into Greek, allegedly done by 70 scholars, so it's called the Septuagint translation. And when the ancient Israelites are talked about, and it's mentioned how they viewed the religious beliefs of people in surrounding cultures like the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, the Persians, etc. The word that they use in Hebrew is translated into Greek in the Septuagint using the word atheoi. Now that probably sounds familiar. Yes, it's the Greek word from which we get the word atheist. And so you can say, well, wait a second. How is it that they viewed the religious beliefs of these people in surrounding nations as if they were atheists? They had, in fact, many gods. They had polytheistic religious belief systems, much like the ancient Greeks did in the time of Socrates and Plato. Well, of course, the answer to that is from the perspective of monotheism, only one God actually exists. They viewed these other cultures as being, for all intents and purposes, atheists because they did not believe in the one existing God, and the gods that they did believe in didn't exist. And from the standpoint of Aquinas' traditional Christian perspective, if you could pass that around, he would have viewed things the same way, that there is only one real option as the creator and designer of the universe. Now we're going to see, and I may or will make Hume's arguments on this visible for you next time, because we're going to look over Hume's traditional criticisms of the design argument. But one of the points that David Hume tries to make is that there's more than one possible conclusion from the same premises that the design argument starts out from. He says from contingent, imperfect, finite things in nature, the design argument asks us to conclude that the designer of this contingent, imperfect, finite world is nonetheless himself infinite and perfect and all-powerful. But Hume says, from the way we actually look at the world and its many imperfections, we could just as easily be led to conclude that the designer of the world, if there was one, would be far less, could even be an inept, inferior deity. And we'll see that Hume speculates that from a strictly logical point of view, there are other options that people like Aquinas don't take into account. Now, you can see this is on the same PowerPoint as Anselm's ontological argument. Now, I think Paley's statement of the design argument is extremely clear. I had a copy of Paley's Natural Theology because when I was in grad school, I used to patronize used bookstores a lot because I was writing in a historical area where many of the books were totally out of print and had been so for over 100 years. So I patronized used bookstores, and I bought a used copy of Paley's Natural Theology. Now, this natural religion or natural theology is a branch of the philosophy of religion. And basically, many of our religious traditions rely on the claim to revelation of a particular book, whether it be the Old Testament, the Old and New Testaments, in Islam, the Quran, or the Book of Mormon, right? And your faith may be based on the belief that a particular revelation is genuine, okay? But apart from that, even theologians who say accept the Bible and church tradition, there's this question of, well, if God really did make the world, shouldn't there be evidences for God in God's own creation? And that gives rise to this area called natural theology. In other words, if we set any claims to revelation of a particular book on the side and just ask, well, could we find any evidences of a supreme being in the world around us, in nature? You know, the design argument is that type of an argument. And this field was called natural theology. The idea is, from nature, what conclusions could we possibly draw concerning the existence or possible existence of a creator of nature? So Paley puts out his work after Hume, about 30 years after Hume. Paley publishes first in 1802. Hume died in 1776, the birthday of our nation, if you talk about the Declaration of Independence. And he, by the way, wished us well in our revolution, even though he was British himself. He liked that we were throwing off tyranny. But basically, Paley gets out this argument that's one of the most famous statements of the design argument, and he's very easily readable. In Great Britain, you're not crossing a field but a heath, right? And we saw this quoted in the video. He says, in crossing a heath, a field, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone and were asked how the stone came to be there. He says, I might possibly answer that for anything I know to the contrary, it had lain there forever. In other words, that the forces of nature simply working together produce the stone wouldn't surprise any of us. I mean, think about it in terms of our own campus, right? You're walking across one of the few grassy areas we have, right? And you look on the ground and there's some pebbles, some stones, there's some fallen twigs, some grass. You have no problem concluding that it was simply the forces of nature coming together that was responsible for those things being there and being what they are. But Paley says, suppose I had found a watch on the ground instead, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. He says the first answer wouldn't do. He says, I should hardly think of the answer which I had before given, that for anything I knew the watch might have always been there, I shouldn't think of that, he says, to be an adequate answer. But now he asks a rhetorical question, yet why should not this answer serve for the watch as well as for the stone? And think of it in terms of, right, you're walking across campus, you wouldn't be surprised finding old twigs that have fallen from trees or rocks there or some grass, but suppose you saw a ballpoint pen laying there in a grassy area beside them. And you know that happens all the time, right? People lose them or throw them away if they ran out of ink. We wouldn't say to ourselves, would we, well, you know, isn't that interesting? Besides some rocks and grass and fallen twigs, the forces of nature have come together, doggone it, to produce a ballpoint pen laying right there on the ground. We wouldn't conclude that, and Paley says if we found an implement like a watch, we wouldn't conclude that either. And of course, we're talking in 1802 about a traditional tick-tock pocket watch. That was portrayed very well in the video, if you were here for that. So Paley asks a rhetorical question, yet why should not this answer, the answer that, hey, the watch just been there forever, created by the forces of nature. Why should that answer not serve for the watch as well as for the stone? Why is it not as admissible in the second case as in the first? And he answers his own question. He says, for this reason and for no other, that when we come to inspect the watch, and here's where purposes come into play, we perceive what we could not discover in the stone, that its several parts are framed and put together for a purpose, right? Hence, teleological as another name for the design argument. Telos meaning a goal or purpose. So the form of this argument has, for almost, 200 years, been portrayed as an argument from analogy. Actually, more than 200 years. 200 years since Hume and Paley's statement of it. In an argument from analogy, anyone take logic yet? I mean, most people don't, but here's how an argument from analogy goes. And you've really seen these types of arguments thrown at you in commercials all the time, where they compare two things. What you do is you compare two things that have some obvious factors in common, some obvious similarities, right? And that's not where you're trying to go with the argument. That's where you start. You say, A is like B in certain obvious respects. But then you want to say, but if they're alike in these respects, might there then be another less obvious, maybe unobservable respect in which they are also alike? Now, what I do in my little selection that your author does not do in the selection of Paley's that's in your textbook is I go down 5 chapters. We're in chapter 1, as you can see, of Paley's book. And I show the other part of the analogy. But I'm going to leave it off here. What happens next is, and you know, when you're reading things, you need to be able to focus on the main points that are made and not let yourself get bogged down in the supporting material that could be very complex. Anyone not take the objective part the other day? Okay. So he goes on to describe the inner workings of an old tick-tock gears and springs type watch in a lot more detail than you and I need, right? But he's just trying to make the basic point that it does have parts that have to work together pretty intricately to move those hands in the right way that enables the watch to be used for telling time. Now, by the way, one of the things he does here is one thing we saw in that handout. Paley tries to anticipate possible objections. We're going to come back to some of these. But note, he says things like, well, first of all, he says that there must have existed at some time at the top of this, and at some place or another, an artificer, that is, a designer and creator, or artificers, who formed the watch for the purpose which we find it actually to answer. So the watch, who understood its construction, comprehended, and designed its use, right? So he says the watch didn't just get the way it was by accident. It needed an external intelligence, a designer. Now, he goes on to anticipate objections, like he says, nor would I nor would it weaken this conclusion if I had never seen a watch made or had never known an artist capable of making one. He says, neither would it invalidate our conclusion that the watch sometimes went wrong, that it wasn't perfect. And he goes into a number of other things. We're going to look at the fourth and fifth ones later about internal causal principles, because Hume focuses on that. But let me go to the bottom line of his main argument, of the analogy. So in chapter 5, and this is not in the part that's in there. Again, this is on Blackboard and supplementary readings for you. He says, every observation which was made in our first chapter, which we just looked at, concerning the watch may be repeated with strict propriety concerning the eye, concerning animals, concerning plants, concerning all the organized parts of the works of nature. In other words, he says there are many things in nature that, like the watch, are intricate mechanisms where the parts work together, be it a part of a plant or an animal, to serve a purpose. And now, as I said, I had a copy of Paley's Natural Theology, and most primary texts in philosophy just have words, narrative. Very rare to find any illustrations in a primary philosophy text. Yeah, you get them in a textbook like Solomon, like your text, but not in primary works. But Paley's work is different. He's got a lot of pen and ink drawings of the different parts of plants and animals, but he's basically trying over and over again to make the same point, that there are many things in nature that are mechanisms that have parts that function together for a purpose. And Paley is particularly particularly enamored with the human eye. He says, were there no example in the world of contrivance? Contrivance is just another word here for design, intelligent design. Of contrivance except that of the eye. He says, it would be alone sufficient to support the conclusion which we draw from it as to the necessity of an intelligent creator. Now notice the word creator. Why is it capitalized? Is that a typo? Because it's in the middle of a sentence. It's not a typo, is it, right? The word is capitalized because he's referring there to the creator, to God, in a traditional Judeo-Christian framework in which he's arguing. So you see what's going on here. Here's the analogy, right? He's saying a man-made implement like a watch is similar to something like the eye in that they both are, we can observe them, that they both have parts that work together to enable them to serve a purpose or function, right? And so he says, now here's the less obvious similarity. In other words, he says, these are alike in this respect, so probably, arguments from analogy are always probabilistic. They're not like the ontological argument we looked at where it tries to conclude the existence of God with mathematical certainty. The design argument just says, well, okay, if the watch needed an external intelligent designer to design it so those parts work together correctly to enable it to fulfill that purpose, then shouldn't an item in nature like the human eye also need an external intelligence, an external designer? And who would that designer be than the God of monotheism? Paley's writing in a traditional Protestant tradition. He would be Church of England. Okay, so as I said, I like multiple exposures to the same thing. One more exposure to the design argument, since I got you here as a captive audience here. We looked at Paley as doing one thing we said was a good thing, which was to anticipate possible objections. David Hume criticized the design argument in his Natural Theology. I'm sorry, Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. But before he criticizes it, he puts it into the mouth of one of his characters, Cleanthes, who has that's a made-up name, putting the Greek word hoanthropos, from which we get anthropology, the Greek word for man or human beings, with the name theis for theism. Cleanthes is somebody who wants God to have human properties like intelligence, like the ability to feel love and mercy. After Newton, it was fashionable to view the whole universe as being like one big clockwork mechanism. It was called the clockwork universe, right? In other words, the planets moved in such predictable orbits, you know, doing so by the laws of nature, that it was like the universe or the world was like a big machine and subdivided into an infinite number of smaller machines like the parts of plants and animals. And now here we get purpose involved in this slide. Now again, this is not David Hume giving the design argument to defend it. He's summarizing the design argument to ultimately criticize it. All these machines and their parts, the parts of things in nature, are admirably and accurately adjusted to one another. In other words, he's making the point that Paley makes a little later, that these are intricate mechanisms where the parts work together. And he says throughout nature, means are adapted toward ends in these various mechanisms in ways that resemble yet exceed the products of human design. In other words, the means of the parts, say, of the human eye or ear are adapted toward their ends, the goal of enabling us to see or hear, in ways that resemble the way a watch works. Hume doesn't say that. He talks about things like buildings and ships. But created items. So what is the conclusion? So again, he says, if the effects, the products of design like a watch or the eye or the ear resemble each other in having intricate parts that need to work together to enable them to fulfill a purpose, by analogy, the causes, the designers must resemble one another. First of all, there ought to be an external designer of the eye and the ear, as well as for the watch. So the design argument has us conclude that here again, if author of nature is capitalized, it's referring to one author of nature, to God. So the author of nature then must be an intelligent mind, like our minds in some respects, because a watch needed an intelligent mind to design it. But since the works of nature are far more complex than something like a simple tick-tock watch or even a ship or a house, the conclusion is not only that there is a designer of nature, that God exists as that designer, but that God has an intelligence similar to human intelligence, except if you go above that, God has larger faculties. In other words, is a much greater mind, because the products of human design are much more complex and greater than the products of human design. So there's, several traditional statements of the design argument, and it's come down to us in more or less that form, and it's portrayed by almost everyone as an argument from analogy. Now,